All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We're in Chapter 17, Section 2, Social and Economic Life. So let's just recall Chapter 17. Chapter 17 is European Transformations. And we're looking specifically between the years 1500 to about 1750. This section, social and economics should be pretty straightforward. This is usually things like trade, money, right? Commodities being bought and sold. Social is a term you may not be as familiar with, but whenever you see the term social, think about society. This is more or less referring to the way that ordinary people lived. History is a lot about kings and queens and rulers. It's a lot about laws and wars. Not a lot of time is dedicated to the way that ordinary people live, but in this section, we're taking a look a little bit at what changed for ordinary people in Europe from 1500 to 1750. The short answer is, at least on this front for ordinary people, not really a lot changed. However, there was some significant change coming in the form of the economy. Recall chapter 16. There was the discovery of the New World, which led to a lot of wealth in Europe, and also the Indian Ocean trade that Portugal took advantage of. And this produced more and more money, and that money pouring into the European continent fundamentally transformed it in a way that it was different from the past. One change that was a result of this was the rise of a new class called the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie is a new, wealthy class of people. And they're primarily involved in trade. So trade is where they get most of their money at. Really prior to this economic kind of resurgence, or not really resurgence, but prior to the growth of the economy due to overseas trade, much of the wealth in Europe was dictated by land, who controlled or owned the most land. That's changing to the point where now its most money can be in trade, specifically overseas trade. And the nation which best represented this transformation was the Dutch Republic. This is also the country of the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic is simply just a name for the government that was in power at the time. And so we'll say that the Dutch Republic is a good example of a bourgeoisie, or bourgeoisie as it looks like, society. And so this class of people is, as time goes on and as trade picks up, that class of people is becoming increasingly powerful over traditional classes like nobles, the landowners, and especially the church. Now, there were also institutions that help facilitate this economic growth. We'll talk about some of them here. The first one is a joint stock company. A joint stock company is a way to organize a business. So it's a business organization which allows the selling of stock, right? And we'll go ahead and illustrate this to kind of better represent what we mean by that. Let's go over here. So when we learned about the voyage of Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus, he had the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And if you recall, his sponsor, or who paid for that voyage, was the King and Queen of Spain. And the idea behind the voyage of Columbus was that the King and Queen of Spain would give him the necessary funds to build this fleet that he would then go off, trade, bring back eventually more money, right? So it cost $2 signs essentially to fund the voyage. Hopefully this trade would yield a profit of $5 signs. And this was the way that most business, or especially trade missions, were funded, by a single, sort of a single investor, so to speak. A joint stock company is different in that it allows a lot of different people to invest in various trade missions. So instead of just having one person like the king or queen of Spain, a lot of people put their money together, build a ship or whatever else is required, right? That ship goes off and trades, and then that yields back, hopefully, to the investor more money than they put in. The ability to sell stocks. So as an individual investor, you give the company your money. They give you a piece of paper called a stock. And if the value of this company goes up, then the value of your stock goes up. And that allows for a couple of things. It is less risky, because if Columbus goes and crashes all of his ships, then the king and queen are out of a lot of money. If this joint stock company crashes his ship, the entire business is out a lot of money, but each individual investor is only out of a little bit of money. It is easier to raise money, right? It's easier to find a lot of people with a little bit of money to put in than one person with a bunch of money. Essentially, the only person who could single-handedly fund Columbus was a ruler, a monarch or king or queen. So it's less risky, it's easier to raise money. It allows for, in some cases, government officials to be investors as well. And this has the consequence of getting laws that are passed that are very favorable towards business. So all of these reasons made joint stock companies a much more effective and efficient way of doing business. Again, the Dutch Republic is a good example of these joint stock companies, but pretty much joint stock companies become commonplace throughout Europe and again, make trade much easier. Stock exchanges are places where stocks in companies can be bought and sold. So places where stocks are bought and sold. Again, making investment available to the wide public. Christopher Columbus couldn't go to every single person out there, but if his company was listed on a stock exchange, any person who had money could potentially invest in that company. Governments also granted monopolies. Monopoly is a legal status to be free from domestic competition. Right? In other words, a monopoly allows you to be the only business in that particular industry, and this was a way for nations to protect certain companies. So, for example, the Dutch East India Company was the only Dutch company which could legally trade in this case, the quote-unquote East, which was the Indian Ocean. And that means that this company, the Dutch East India Company, doesn't have to worry about other Dutch companies competing with them. And when one is the only business in town, you're able to manipulate prices and become very powerful. Now, of course, the Dutch had to compete with the English and the Portuguese and the French and a lot of these other nations. But these legal monopolies, to be free from any domestic competition, made them some of the most powerful businesses ever to exist. In fact, the Dutch East India Company is the most powerful and wealthy corporation / business to ever have existed, even to this modern day. Insurance also helped reduce risks. So reduce risk. You can buy insurance in case your ship crashes during overseas trade. Governments constructed canals, which are man-made rivers, to further facilitate trade. So all of these things together, right? All of these institutions, and again, the Dutch are a good example, but all of these things were taking place in various European countries, but all of these things help trade, right? All of these things help trade flourish. Now, one last term here that we can define, the gentry. The gentry is a class, so really the class situation in Europe is that you have this sort of new money, so to speak, and the new money is the bourgeoisie. But then you also have old money, and those are the people who traditionally were the landowners. The gentry is sort of a combination of that. They're new money, so people who make their money in trade turned old. They buy land, they try to marry into aristocratic families. Recall that in Europe, really prior to 1500, one's entire social status and wealth was based upon two things: bloodlines and land ownership. Because there was really no trade in Europe prior to 1500, or at least very little trade, those that were wealthy and powerful always had inherited it and also always got it from the land that they owned. So a lot of this new money, a lot of the people who had recently made their money in trade wanted to have sort of the prestige of old money. They wanted to marry into noble families. They wanted to own large estates. They wanted to become sort of aristocrats themselves. And that's the class that we refer to simply as the gentry. Here we have a couple of images. This is showing kind of the emerging urban economy. This guy looks like a fish salesman in the new, more economically active cities. This is a map from the Netherlands or the Dutch, kind of showing you the extent to which they were involved in global and overseas trade and a lot of that money being brought back into Europe. What about peasants and laborers? So if you're not entirely familiar, a peasant is a farmer, right? Farmer. And for the most case, this sort of increase in economic activity here, this was largely relegated to the city, right? This was mostly a city or an urban phenomenon. And most people living in Europe were not living in the city and were not, urban dwellers, so to speak. Most people were farmers, most people were peasants. And the bottom line, when it came to peasants and laborers, not too much changed, right? Not too much changed between 1500 and 1750. There were some minor changes. One example was serfdom. Serfdom is a form of labor where a serf, that's what the person was called, is quote unquote tied to the land. So serfdom is kind of a form of coerced labor. It is not quite strict as slavery, but it's not being a complete free peasant or farmer either. Typically, serfs were legally tied to a plot of land, which they were required to work. In some ways, serfs could be treated like slaves, but there was a lot more freedom in that version or that source of labor. Serfdom across Western Europe was on the decline, especially from about the bubonic plague, that was 1300, really just continuously all the way into the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, etc., etc. One part of Europe in which serfdom remained the predominant form of labor was Eastern Europe. So still, we'll say the sort of strong institution of serfdom, right? But elsewhere in Western Europe, serfdom was much more so on the decline. Life as a peasant or as a farmer or as a laborer in Europe between 1500 and 1750 was very tough. Famine was very frequent. That is to run, or famine really refers to the inability of crops to grow or not having enough food. So lack of food, we'll say, for famine. And famines were very common throughout Europe. In fact, every winter, most people in Europe didn't know whether or not they would survive and have enough to eat to make it to the next growing season. This was only compounded by an event known as the Little Ice Age, which was a period of cooling. The global temperature dropped for about 200 years or so, roughly between 1400 and maybe 1650, somewhere around there. And that put a lot of pressure on famine. That led to a lot of bad harvests, which led to people dying and starving to death. Now, there did come some alleviation after the discovery of the Americas. Two very important foods were introduced to Europe, which made peasants' life and famine a little less likely. So the Americas, recall, discovered in 1492, brought two important foods. And of course, those foods are potatoes and maize. Maize is corn, if you're not familiar. And what was very kind of fascinating about potatoes and maize, potatoes in particular, was that even though Europe was primarily a wheat growing region, wheat, bread, stuff like that, typically wheat was too expensive for the peasants themselves to eat. And so potatoes and maize could supplement that diet. Potatoes just turn out to be a very nutritious food. They're very easy to grow, and entire islands like Ireland came to rely solely on the potato. It's somewhat of a miracle food. The potato didn't exist in the Old World until the voyage of Columbus brought that over. So that was some alleviation, you might say. Environmentally, the growing population, so recall that the population is growing, put a lot of pressure on the environment. Most of the way that people kept warm or cooked food, the primary fuel for which people provided or sustained was wood, which led to a lot of chopping down of trees and deforestation, places like France and England. You also had other industries that put pressure on the environment, things like mining, for example. And mining only increased when wood was replaced by coal. So coal replaced wood as a fuel source. It turned out that coal was cheaper, right? As opposed to chopping down a tree, one could dig coal out of the ground. Now, this situation, not just in terms of rural poverty, but also urban poverty, led many elite, kind of the elite classes to view poverty through these two different lenses. So let's just go ahead and just sort of summarize here. It was a very tough poverty, ill health, right? These are all things that describe the peasants in Europe. To get back to the point I was just making, the elite classes viewed poverty and people who were, struggling in this particular time period through two different lenses: the deserving poor and the unworthy poor. The deserving and the unworthy poor. So deserving poor are poor not by their own fault. So there were some elites that recognized that perhaps there were some people out there who were poor not because of any of their own responsibilities, not because of their own moral failings. This accounted for maybe 10% to 20% of those who were in poverty. Most were considered unworthy poor. That was poor because, essentially, not because they chose to, but poor because it's their fault. There's something wrong with their morality. They're not disciplined enough. They need to read their Bible more. And that, if only they had engaged in, a harder work ethic and became more moral and, didn't fall victim to various temptations, they could alleviate themselves or get themselves out of poverty. This sort of dual viewpoint to address the situation of poverty is going to continue, especially in Europe and other places, much long afterwards. All of these circumstances could lead to rebellions. And in fact, there were many peasant rebellions in Europe between 1500 and 1750. In terms of what life was like for women and families, in Europe, primarily, the life of women was dictated by their husbands. Husbands had what we might call a lot of control over their wives, legally and socially and culturally. Also, the fact that the status of women was also very closely tied to their husbands. So women's status would more or less be that of their husbands. And in Europe, it was much more about class and wealth than it was about particularly gender or men and women. So for example, on the one hand, you could have very powerful women like the Queen of Spain, right? The Queen. And then on the other hand, you might have at the other extreme a woman who's the serf or the wife of a serf, who is then, at the lower end of that class and wealth level. Now, marriage in Europe was a little bit different. There were some unique characteristics about marriage in Europe as compared to other places. In terms of spouses, a spouse is either a husband or a wife. People in Europe had much more freedom to choose their spouse. This was not the case in a lot of other countries or a lot of parts of the world. In most parts of the world, marriages were arranged. They were born out of necessity. It's true that the European nobility engaged in many arranged marriages, but for typical peasants and workers, most people got to choose who they wanted to marry. It's also true that marriage was much later in life. Men would be, late 20s, maybe 28 or so. Women would be maybe mid to early 20s, 24. This was much later in life than most other marriages around the world, where people were getting married in their teens. One social, you might say, issue or cause, this was especially true in the urban areas, was orphans, and that is, children whose parents either, leave them or abandon them. In other words, it's a child, without parents. And especially in the urban areas where, yes, there was a bourgeoisie, yes, there was an emerging class, but there was still a good constituency of urban poor, and problems of poverty would be something, and specifically orphans, is going to be something that a lot of those cities need to address.